Muy buenos días. Estamos dejando que entren todos los
All with
participantes.
letting everyone
Demos
come into the
un
room.
minutico.
Let's give them an extra minute.
Están entrando.
People are just coming in.
Bueno, muy buenos días.
Well, very good morning to you
Soy
all.
María
Once
Camila
again,
Uribe,
my name is
la
Maria Camila
coordinadora de las
Uribe.
necesidades del país. Les damos
The
la más
manager
cordial
of the
bienvenida a este
IDB
primer seminario
Urban Planning
de la
Network. So
serie
welcome
de
you
ciudades
to this
más
first
resilientes en
seminar
América
to the
Latina y
More
el Caribe
Resilient
que me
Cities in
da
Latin America and the
muchísimo
Caribbean
gusto que
series
empecemos hoy.
for urban planning risk
Abordaremos
management.
la importancia de
So we're going to
incorporar
be
los
talking
estudios
about
de
the importance
riesgo
of
y
bringing
análisis
risk
ambientales
studies
en la
and
planificación
environmental
territorial de las
analysis in
ciudades
territory planning of
para anticipar
cities to
riesgos
be able to
y
guarantee
amenazas,
or
pero
anticipate
también
risks
para
and
proteger
threats,
los
but
ecosistemas
also
y
to protect
orientar el desarrollo
ecosystems
urbano más
and
sostenible.
guide a much more resilient
Además
urban
de un
development.
panel de discusión
Besides
con
a
expertos
discussion panel
residentes,
with
hoy también
experts in this issue,
conoceremos
we'll
casos
also
de estudio en ciudades,
get to know study cases in
algunas en Chile
cities,
y en República
some
Dominicana.
in Chile and some at the Dominican
En este
Republic.
seminario de hoy tendremos
During this seminar,
participaciones
we will
en
have
español y
panelists
en
that will
inglés.
be speaking
Como siempre
Spanish
tendremos
and English.
interpretación
As
simultánea
always, we're
del
going to have
portugués,
simultaneous
inglés y español.
interpretation, both in
Y
Portuguese, English, and
acuérdense que
Spanish.
para
And
acceder
let's remember that to be able
a la
to access the
interpretación
interpretation
está el
module,
icono del
we
globo
have the
en el
globe
Zoom, en la
icon in
parte de
Zoom
abajo,
in
y
the
ahí
lower
seleccionar
part,
el
and that
idioma de preferencia.
you will be able to
This
select
webinar is
your language
being
of
held
preference.
in Spanish and in English today with simultaneous interpretation available in Portuguese, English, and Spanish. To access it, click the globe icon on the Zoom and select your preferred language. También acordarles,
Also,
antes de
let's,
empezar, que las
I would like to
preguntas
remind you
nos las
before
pueden
we start
enviar
that you
en la
can
sesión
forward
de
us your
Q&A
questions, put them in
para
the Q&A
que
session
nuestros panelistas
so
también
that our
puedan
panelists
verlas.
can also
Y
see them.
también acordarles que la
And also
grabación
let's
estará
remember
disponible en el
that
canal
we're
de
going
YouTube
to
del
have the
BID
recording of
y
this
compartiremos el
on
enlace
the YouTube
como
channel of
siempre.
the IDB.
La red de ciudades conecta cerca de
The
300
city
ciudades en la
network
región,
connects
promoviendo el
close to
intercambio de
300 cities in the
soluciones
region,
urbanas y
fostering
herramientas de
is a
gestión,
platform to
fortaleciendo el liderazgo
foster the
local y la
exchange of
capacidad
experiences between
técnico
cities in Latin
y
America and the
ampliando
Caribbean,
alianzas
aiming to
con
create
diferentes
capacities
actores del sector
to
público, privado,
foster
academia,
social
otros
and urban development that can be
tipos de
sustainable in the
actores.
region with
Nuestro objetivo
PPPs and
es
other
acompañar
multilateral
a los
organisms. Our
gobiernos
objective is
locales
to
en
assist
la
local
construcción de
governments
ciudades
in
más
the
sostenibles,
construction of
inclusivas
much more
y
resilient,
productivas.
inclusive, and productive cities.
Entonces, ahora sí,
So
empecemos
now
con la
let's
sesión
get
de
into
hoy.
it with today's
Este
session. So
seminario
this
de riesgo y planificación
seminar,
urbana es el primero
this is the
de la
first
serie de ciudades
of a
más resilientes en
series
América
of
Latina y el
much more
Caribe.
cities in
Esta es la
Brazil,
segunda serie que
cities in Latin
realizamos
America and the
en
Caribbean.
este
This is the second
año
series that we're going to
2025
be
y los
going to have
invitamos a
in the year
participar con
2025. We
nosotros
invite you to
en seminarios
participate
que
in
realizaremos.
other seminars that we will
El
hold.
siguiente,
The
que
next
será el próximo
webinar
miércoles, será
will be
sobre
next
gobernanza para
Wednesday
la gestión de
about
riesgos en
governance
ciudades.
for
La siguiente
management in
semana
cities.
tendremos soluciones basadas
And the
en
upcoming
naturaleza en ciudades
week, we're
y
going to
posteriormente
have everything that
bases
has to
para la
do
resiliencia en
with
ciudades. Así que la idea
cities
es que
or
podamos
solutions based in
tener
nature for cities
una buena
and
mezcla de
resilience
todos los
data
trabajos
or urban
que
resilience data for
las
cities. So
ciudades
it's
están
a great
adelantando
mixture
y
of
que
everything
tenemos
that we're doing in
varios
cities.
expertos que
And
pueden
obviously
compartir con
we
nosotros su
have a lot of
conocimiento
experts
para
that can
ayudar
share their
a
knowledge with us to be
las ciudades
able
a trabajar en estos
to
temas.
help cities
En
to
los links
work in these
estamos
issues.
también compartiendo
So we're
para que se puedan
sharing
inscribir
some links with you, so you can
los que
drop
se
us a
perdieron la
line.
primera
Those
serie,
of
que
you who
era
missed the
la
first
serie de
series,
productividad,
which was the
ciudades
series
más
of
producidas
productivity,
y
much more
seguras en
productive
América
and safe
Latina y el
cities in
Caribe,
Latin America and the
también
Caribbean.
ahí pueden ver
Obviously,
en
there
la
you can
en el link
check out
pueden ver
in our link, you
las
can
grabaciones.
check
Y
out all
finalmente
these recordings.
acordarles
And
que tienen
finally,
que
I would like to remind you
incluir
that
si quieren
if you want,
recibir
if you
el
want to
newsletter de
receive
la red
the
y
newsletter of
recibir
this
toda esta
network
información
and define all
en
this
el link que
info
estamos compartiendo.
in the link that
Pero
share
bueno,
with you, you can
¿por qué
do just that.
hablamos hoy
So
de gestión
why
de
are we
riesgos
talking
en
about risk
planificación urbana?
management in
En
planning
América Latina,
and urban planning?
millones de
So in
personas se
Latin
ven
America,
expuestas
millions
a
of
los riesgos
people
de
are
desastre.
exposed
Solo
to this
4 de cada
natural
10
disaster
municipios
risks. Only
cuentan con
4 out of
planes de
10
gestión
municipalities
actualizados y
have
efectivos,
updated
y esto
risk
limita su
management plans.
capacidad de
And
respuesta
that obviously
ante las
limits the
diferentes
response
emergencias.
capacity in the face of
En
different
este mismo
emergencies.
contexto,
So in this same
lamentablemente
context,
cerca del 60%
unfortunately,
de las
close to
muertes por
60%
desastre
of natural
ocurren en
disasters
asentamientos
disaster
lugares
casualties
donde no se
happen
aplica
in
una
informal
prevención de
settlements,
riesgos
where we don't apply anything that has to do with
desde el punto de
disaster
vista del
risk
plan
management from the point of view of planning, of
Y por
urban planning.
eso,
And this
una
is
de
why
las ideas de la
one of the
conversación de hoy
ideas of
es
today's
cómo integrar
conversation
esos estudios de
is how
riesgo
to
y los
integrate
análisis
those risk
ambientales en
studies
la
and those
planificación
environmental
territorial.
analysis in
¿Qué
everything has to do with
herramientas
territorial
como
planning.
evaluaciones ambientales
What tools,
estratégicas, plataformas
as for
espaciales
example,
y el
platforms
mapeo de riesgos
and everything that
pueden
has to do with
ayudarnos
risk
a
mapping can
tomar
help us
mejores
to
decisiones
make
informadas
better decisions,
con datos?
informed
Y
decisions with
también
data.
conocer casos
And
concretos
also
en
to get
ciudades de
to
América
know
Latina que
concrete
promueven
cases
el
in cities in
desarrollo
America
urbano
that will foster
mucho más
urban development
resiliente.
in a much more
Hoy
resilient way.
tenemos el
Today,
gusto
we have
de
the
tener a Ginés
pleasure
Suárez,
of
que es
having
especialista
Gines
senior
Suarez. He's a
de
senior
de
specialist,
riesgo y desastres del
risk
y
specialist,
nos modera la
natural risk
sesión de hoy.
disasters of the
Y
IDB. He
tendremos
will be the
finalmente
moderator
un
into
panel de
this session.
conversación
And first,
en el
we
que
will have a conversation
participará
panel in which
Jenny
we will have
Allenby,
the
que es el
participation of
director de innovación
Jeff
espacial
Allenby, which will
del
be the
Center for
Geospatial
Geospatial
Innovation Director for
Solutions
the Center
del
for
Lincoln
Geospatial
Institute.
Solutions
Bienvenido, Jeff.
from Lincoln Institute.
También
Jeff,
tendremos a
welcome.
Roberto
Also,
Ponce
we will have
López, que es
Roberto
el
Ponce
investigador
Lopez.
en
He's
sistemas de
an urban
información urbana
information
en el
systems
Centro para el
researcher
Futuro de
in the
Ciudades y
he's
profesor asociado
at
en
the
la Escuela de
center of
Gobierno
the
y Transformación
Monterrey
Pública del TEC Monterrey.
Technological
Muy
Public
bienvenido
Transformation
también,
Center in
Roberto.
Mexico. Roberto, welcome.
En la segunda parte
Then,
conoceremos
in the
la
second
experiencia
part,
de dos ciudades,
we will get to know the
Ciudad de
experience of
México,
two cities, as I
que
mentioned
integran estudios
before,
de análisis de
that
riesgo
integrate
en sus
risk analysis
instrumentos
studies
de
in
ordenamiento del
their
territorio.
land use
Y para ello
studies. And
tendremos
for that, we
a
will
Alex
have
Jiménez, que es
Alex
asociado
Jimenez,
principal de planificación
is
urbana y diseño de ARUP.
the
Tenemos
associate
a
for
Luis
planning,
Amauros
for urban
Tavares,
planning
director
and
de
design
planeación
for the
urbano del municipio
ARUP.
de San
Also, we
Felipe
have
de
the
Puerto
Luis
Plata
Amauris
en
Tavares. He's
República
the
Dominicana.
urban planning
Y
director
tendremos a
for the municipality of
Francisley
Puerto Plata in the Dominican
Contardo, que es la
Republic. And we
directora
will
del
also
sector
have
público y
Francisca
asesora
Contardo, who is the
urbanística de
director
la
of
Municipalidad de Lo
public space
Barnechea en
and
Santiago de
obviously
Chile.
everything that has to do with
Y
the Lo
finalmente
Barnechea
tendremos
municipality in Santiago.
tiempo
And then
para
we'll have
contestar algunas preguntas de la audiencia que
some
nos hayan
minutes for to
enviado
do some Q&A.
por el chat, por el Q&A. Pero tal vez antes de
So
empezar,
before we
también
get started,
como ya es costumbre,
and as I mentioned
nos
before, and
gustaría
as we're
también
accustomed
escuchar
to,
un
we would
poco
like to
del
hear
lado
a
de
little bit
ustedes. Para
from
eso vamos a
your
usar la
end
herramienta de Mentimeter,
to
así que les pido el
use the
favor
Mentimeter
que
tool.
con
So
su
I kindly
teléfono
ask you to please
escaneen
scan the
o entren a
QR
Mentimeter con
code
esta
or go to
información
Mentimeter
para
Connects
que puedan
information
respondernos
so
un poco
that we can
unas
answer
preguntas
some questions
sobre
about
este tema y conocer de
this
primera
type
mano
of
lo
issue
que ustedes
and get to
piensan.
know
Entonces,
firsthand
los invito
what
a
we're
escanear
doing.
este código
So I invite you to scan this QR
QR
code
para ver las preguntas que tenemos
to
en el
take a look at the questions that we have ready for you.
A ver, vamos a la primera pregunta.
So let's go to question 1.
Y la primera pregunta
And
que
the first
no
question
alcanzaron
is,
a escanear, la pueden escanear
if you
ahorita,
don't
es
scan it, you
qué
can scan it right
instrumentos o
now. It's
herramientas
what instruments or
utilizan en su
tools
ciudad, que
does
ustedes
your
saben
city
que
use to
utilizan en su ciudad
anticipate
para
or
anticipar y
foresee
prevenir
any type of
los
risks
riesgos en los
in
procesos de
any
planificación
land
territorial.
use process
Un instrumento o una
or territorial
herramienta
planning
de la
uses?
información, del conocimiento que tengan, ¿qué están usando en su ciudad?
What are they using in your city?
Bueno, estudios de riesgo, big data,
Risk studies, big data,
atlas de riesgo,
risk atlas,
información, planos,
information
datos,
data,
mapas cartográficos,
cartographic maps,
Google Maps,
Google Maps,
plan regulador,
regulating plan,
participación.
participation.
Bueno.
All right.
Diálogo ciudadano, planes de contingencia,
citizen dialogue,
historia,
contingency plans, software.
Bueno, vamos a la segunda pregunta.
Okay, now let's go to
¿Cuál es el
question 2.
mayor desafío
What is
de
the
las
greatest
ciudades
challenge for
integrar
cities in
estudios de
integrating
riesgo en
risk
la
studies into
planificación
territorial
territorial?
planning?
Entonces, acá les hemos puesto 5
So
alternativas.
here we're giving you 5
Tiene un tema de
alternatives.
recursos,
If it's
tiene un tema
anything
de
that has to do
capacidades
about financial
técnicas,
resources, about technical
es un tema de
capacity, if it's
coordinación
something about
entre
institutional and
los
multi-level
diferentes
coordination,
niveles de gobierno
political
con los
will,
municipios
lack
aledaños,
of data
si es un tema
analysis,
de voluntad política, en donde se encuentran las
so where you
dificultades,
find the most
o
difficulties, or
simplemente
if it's just
una falta
about
de
a lack
información
of
o de
data,
análisis de datos. Así que los
data
invitamos
analysis. So,
a pensar cuál es
so we
el
invite
principal
you to think
desafío que ustedes
what is
creen
the main
que
challenge
estamos
that you
teniendo
think
en estos
we
temas
are
de
having in these
coordinación
issues
territorial.
right now.
Bueno, el tema de coordinación se ve muy importante, el
So everything
tema
that has to do with
político.
coordination.
Bueno, pues Ginés, con este
So,
contexto,
Ginés, with this
creo que
context,
vamos a tener una
I
conversación
think
muy
that
interesante
we're
el
going
día
to
de
have a
hoy,
really fruitful
entendiendo también
conversation,
cuáles son los
an interesting
desafíos
conversation,
que las
understanding what are the
ciudades nos están
challenges
contando. Así que,
that the
sin
cities
más,
are telling us about. So without further
Ginés,
ado,
bienvenido y muchas
Ginés,
gracias por
welcome,
acompañarnos hoy.
and thank you for
Adelante.
being here with us today.
Sí,
Go ahead.
muchísimas gracias, María Camila. No, desde
Thank you
luego
very much, Maria Camila.
interés
Of course, the
revelador,
Mentimeter
es súper
is
interesante lo
quite
que nos está
revealing.
comentando la audiencia
Obviously,
sobre cuáles
it's
crees que son los
something
temas
that the audience tells us about what are the
críticos hoy. Y
key
bueno, ahora vamos a
issues,
compartir un
the most
poco
critical issues. Now we're going to be
con
sharing a
nuestros
little bit
panelistas
about
sobre temas
this with our
específicos, pero sin
panelists.
perder de la mente lo que está
Well,
levantando
without losing
la
track
audiencia de la
of what
importancia que
the
tienen
audience is
estos temas de
telling us
coordinación
on the
política,
importance that it has to do with political will,
que se puedan
coordination, which are
operativizar
key
esta
so
integración de
that we can
gestión de
operate
riesgo en la
and use
planificación
this
urbana.
integration
Sin
of
más,
risk management and urban
paso a mi
planning.
primer
So
panelista,
without further ado,
Jeff
now I'm going to go to
Allenby,
my first panelist, to Jeff Allenby
del Lincoln Institute.
from the
Y
Lincoln
quería un
Institute.
poco, Jeff,
And I wanted
que nos
Jeff a
contaras un
little,
poco, ¿no?
can you tell
Cómo el
us a little
Centro
bit
para
about
Soluciones
how
Geoespaciales
does
del Lincoln
your
Institute genera una cantidad de
Center
información
for
muy
Geospatial
importante para
Solutions
la
at the Lincoln
planificación
Institute
a
create
través de
information
sistemas
for
de información
planning
geográfica,
through
teledetección,
geographic information
inteligencia
system,
artificial, que nos
AI,
gustaría
and
saber
others? So,
en
Jeff,
América Latina,
in Latin
¿cómo tú crees
America,
que los gobiernos
how
locales
do
de
you
América
think
Latina
that
pueden
local governments
aprovechar
in Latin
toda esa
America can
información, todas
use
esas
all that
herramientas
information and all those
geoespaciales
tools,
avanzadas que estáis
geospatial
generando
tools that you are
para desarrollar
generating
sistemas de
to
alerta
develop
temprana en apoyo
early
de riesgo
alert
que
system and
fortalezcan
risk mapping
todo lo que
systems
es
that
la
can
resiliencia
strengthen
urbana
everything that has to
ante
do with
amenazas
urban
naturales?
resilience in the face of natural threats.
The floor is yours, Jeff.
The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here today. And I appreciate the translators for helping translate from English to Spanish and Portuguese. There is a lot of new data and information coming out on a daily basis related to urban planning, both from the perspective of mapping what's on the ground in terms of roads, in terms of buildings, as well as the natural world, and having a better understanding of where risks are. Increasingly, what we're seeing is new tools and new data sets that are being provided by partners like the European Union's Copernicus program, like NASA, where it's not reliant on a municipality to be able to create all of the data and products from start to finish. Oftentimes, they can leverage things that are being provided by partners to be able to understand kind of underlying risk and combine that with their mapping of infrastructure or planned infrastructure to be able to understand where you may have more vulnerable communities. There's also a lot of new data and toolboxes being created in open source platforms that allow municipalities to incorporate information and be able to map and model their risk more effectively without having expensive or really hard to use tools. So just independent of how big of a city is or how big of a budget you may have, there's a variety of tools that allow you to really be able to focus in and understand where you may have higher risks to certain populations, where your infrastructure may not be as strong, where you may have more informal settlements that inherently may not have the same resilience built into them or higher concentrations of populations in a vulnerable place. Oftentimes what we encourage people to think about and to work on is not as much what are the specific data sets that I need, but really what are the insights that you want to understand from the outcome of understanding where you may have higher risk or more vulnerable populations, and to work back from there and to find where you may have the right tool to help get to that piece, as well as trying to understand the variety of partners that are available from international humanitarian organizations, from technology companies, or from universities. There's a lot of successful partnerships where universities, both within a country as well as outside a country, can work with municipal governments to understand their risk and vulnerability.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Realmente sí existe mucha información.
Yeah, really, there's a lot of information that's available, and the key is to know what is the question and what is the problem that we're trying to solve, obviously, as you mentioned before. Now, moving on to Roberto. Roberto, as a leader from the developing team of urban information, metropolitan information, where you're collecting geographical and social data, can you tell us a little bit about in lieu of motivating our audience here, what are some successful experience where that information contributed effectively for some urban planning that considered disaster risks? And obviously, what are the challenges? Obviously, the Mentimeter obviously showed us that besides information and other things, there are other things that are key so that an integration can take place. Can you tell us a little bit about what are the main challenges that you see from your experience? Because talk to us a little bit about some successful experience, but some of the challenges and some of the lessons learned with this experience. Thank you. Of course, I don't have a specific successful case that I can share with you, to be honest. We, from the Tecnológico de Monterrey, which is a huge university in Mexico, we collaborate with some governments, and we've created some urban development plans and some other risk atlas. We stopped doing that some years ago because okay, so from our experience, what we saw is that this planning model that exists in Mexico is not feasible, is not accurate. The plans that we create tend to do a really macro analysis, and there's one about technology, but mainly, obviously, cartographic representation, GIS, and that's it. So the participation of the community is limited. And obviously, this is a list. What it's done in Mexico and some countries in the region is quite similar, but there's a very particular anchored way in how these planning exercises are carried out. So that's what taught at the university, that's what consultants do, and what public officials demand. And after those experiences, we have been looking for some different alternatives for planning. And one of the important sources has been the Lincoln Institute, actually. They have actually a consortium for scenario planning. And obviously, we think that this type of methodologies that are much more modern, that are known as planning by scenarios, will be a better way of addressing our risks. And obviously, presents some future challenges. Currently, in Monterrey is the second most important city in Mexico, Monterrey. We are seeing a scenario planning exercise. And actually, we use technologies, but in a different way, to be honest. It's not only about representing maps per se, and but there's a series of tools, simpler tools, and some other ones are more complicated, to be honest, where we show the future and what will be an inertial scenario if the city keeps expanding itself, and what will be the natural areas, the protected areas, for example, etc., etc. So obviously, this is just not only about risk representation, but about some other representations as well. And actually, this is a series of long-term tools. It's much more complex to do this, because this is effort that takes 1, 2 to 3 years, where we involve some technical team that is sophisticated in this series of tools. Part of the innovation in these tools as well is a tax model, where we explore risks, etc., etc. So it's really important, because this tax model, what it does is to create the centers, is how much more resources is the city going to put in. So obviously that's quite important, because when we do this risk management planning, we involve the construction of infrastructure. And many times in Mexico, in the plans, we create a list, let's call it a project list, to mitigate risks that never happen, to be honest. So by anchoring to a tax model, it's a discussion and saying, okay, we have this bag of resources, and what do we need to advertise any disaster risk management? So for us, in Approach, this is an ongoing project. Obviously, we started in February. So that's been a little bit of my experience. Thank you. Excellent, Roberto. Quite interesting to see a little bit in how we start talking about mapping and by doing map and by creating maps. But at the end of the day, we see that this is an accumulated experience, that maps on itself are not the right approach. And obviously, that's what translate that for the cities, what's the benefit and what is the income that the municipality is going to see by receiving this model of this possible growth pattern. Actually sounds quite interesting, and it's completely in line with the Mentimeter, because at the end it said, because the maps were at the lowest, but however, we're talking about things, for example, political will, coordination, scenario planning, etc., etc. So obviously it fits quite well with that approach. That's excellent, Roberto, and get to know and that you're taking to Monterrey. Now, let's move in on to Jeff once again. And now let's go back to technology. We'd like to ask you, Jeff, about the technological aspect of things and other issues as well. For example, with regards to risk mapping and alert systems. What are the technologies that, from your experience, for risk mapping and alert systems, early alert system, you consider the most feasible for the context of municipalities with limited resources? And if you could please enlighten us case that have applied these technologies. Thank you.
Sure. There's a lot of technologies available to help with both the early warning systems as well as risk mapping. And a lot of it depends on how engaged or involved local staff want to be, how much they want to learn new technologies. But also there's a variety of products that are available that really allow, provide information to a municipality where they don't need to create everything, themselves. On the training side, there's a variety of resources from NASA, the US agencies, RSET program, the Applied Remote Sensing Training Program, that provides access to data on how to do a variety of risk mapping, climate mapping, using satellite data from NASA's Landsat program, as well as the European Union's Copernicus program. And a lot of those trainings are also offered in Spanish, which is really helpful. And so for a municipality that wants to take on a little bit more themselves, they can look at the different trainings that are available and begin to implement them. That does require more work, and staff with at least a base level of understanding, both on the GIS and remote sensing, as well as the disaster mapping side, to make sure that it's being done appropriately. On the more product side, there's other things. The Pacific Disaster Center, that's housed at the University of Hawaii, provides both training, collaboration, I'll talk about more in a second, as well as a platform called Disaster Aware that is both a paid platform, but also has free access for disaster managers. And this is a global platform that looks at providing near real-time AI-enhanced hazard information for about 28 different types of natural or man-made or biological hazard types. Things like cyclones and hurricanes, landslides, flash flooding. And that is a way where a municipality may not have to focus on doing all of the data analysis themselves, but more focused on just applying the information that others are providing, and that may have a cost or may not have a cost depending on exactly who you are and kind of the perspective from that. There's also programs like the Resilient Cities Network that operates globally, but has a focus on Latin America and the Caribbean. And that has both resources to help with disaster planning, as well as in some cases access to data. One of our partners, a company called Alpha Geo, provides a variety of risk metrics, again, globally, but in particular across Latin America and the Caribbean. And they've provided information to the Resilient Cities Network. They can also provide overview for a city in terms of kind of different risk factors. And then again, they have a paid tier that allows you to get more into site-specific mapping and modeling for a variety of different risks, from heat mapping to flooding, stuff like that. Another partner of ours, Upstream Tech, has an award-winning hydro forecast model that does operate across Latin America. They've been doing some pilot studies in Brazil. That is a paid platform, but has really good both short and long-term hydrologic forecasting, again, based on AI models that allows users to have that early warning system of when you may have flash flooding or, different types of conditions. With all of those, it really is needed to combine the risk modeling with infrastructure modeling. And in that case, some municipalities have done a really good job of mapping things like building footprints, streets, bridges, other infrastructure. But things like the Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team is doing a lot about filling in those gaps and helping, a municipality map out where their infrastructure is. The Overture Maps Foundation incorporates a lot of that information with information from partners like Microsoft and Google and Esri to be able to provide open data that we've been using in a lot of our modeling around common urban extent and urban extension, from things like road networks and where buildings are and when those buildings were created, to be able to understand, where you may have older buildings or newer, things like informal settlement mapping, that really allow you to get that data for free and download it. You do have to have some kind of processing capacity within your government or people who know how to interact with those systems, but allow you to combine both the risk mapping with the infrastructure mapping to understand where you may have some more vulnerable communities. With that, we have seen a number of really good use cases of both city level and country level incorporation of this data and technology. I mentioned the Pacific Disasters Center a second ago. They partnered with the Colombian government to be able to do a national assessment of risk, where they're leveraging the experience in the academic community with the PDC at the University of Hawaii, but working with local partners to be able to understand, local context, be able to get participatory input from local communities, and be able to look nationally at where some of that risk is. They also did a pilot looking at low-cost sensor networks, particularly for landslides in the city of Medellin, to be able to understand where you have vulnerable populations from large-scale modeling, deploy those low-cost sensors in the most vulnerable areas, and then create an early warning system for landslides, where they found, I think the cost was between 5 and 41 euros per person protected by these systems, but really identifying different areas that are vulnerable and creating an early warning system for about 200,000 people for relatively low cost. And so there's a number of different case studies I'd be happy to talk about, other data sets. I'll drop a set of links into the chat window as well for some of the different resources that I talked about. But overall, there's a lot of information, there's a lot of training that's available. Oftentimes it requires someone with the ability or the interest or the latitude sometimes for, a director saying, yes, explore this data set and figure out how it can be applied. But there's also a lot of partners out there who are already doing this work that would really be interested in being able to apply it and help protect local populations.
Muchas gracias, Jeff. Desde luego existe
Thank
mucha
you.
información.
Of course, there's plenty of information on training and possible partners to carry out these analysis. I am actually going to do a commercial at the bank, because at the bank we're developing a hub, risk hub, and what we want to do is to connect the government at the municipal and national level with the existing resources for training, and we hope to launch this hub in November this year for the COP30 in Milan. Thank you, Jeff, and we are waiting for the links, because I'm sure that many people are interested in getting to know all the information that you are able to share with us through the chat. Now, circle back to Roberto. Speaking about planning, now we're going to talk a little more about in your planning processes. You mentioned, for example, the tax issue, making it visible in particular scenarios. What strategy would you recommend to mayors, planners, to achieve something as difficult as balancing urban growth, environmental protection, and risk management? What is your specific experience? How do you see that to generate that change? That we need a shift in the paradigm, and what key actions you see that, beyond those that you mentioned, or you want to delve into the already mentioned? Well, thank you, Ginés. So this is a very complex subject, a kept problem, because as people call it, because there isn't a one-size-fits-all solution for all cities. Something that I can see is that there needs to be a quantitative area of data modeling and data sets, and it must be accompanied by a process with the communities where the people can participate as citizens, and where their points of view can be taken into account. In the end, or at the end, in the council, as we did, and that is what we're trying to do in our job and represent in Latin America. On top of that, we also have the political side, because these exercises require political will and then linkage between different jurisdictions and administration. So it's basically running three processes at the same time: the technical, the community process, and the political process that is, of course, very important. You have the different politicians adopt everything. This is different to what happens, for example, in the United States, where things are a little more straightforward, where there are other authorities that juggle everything together to run everything as smoothly as possible. Another complex issue here in Latin America is that the most vulnerable populations are the most exposed. So there is an environmental justice component that we need to work on in the region, and must be included actively in our plans. Another important topic is that usually our cities involve different jurisdictions, counties, municipalities, departments, states, however they are called, and they all need to come together and agree. And a paradox that arises, and that is helpful, is that municipalities, the richest people in the municipalities, have very solid urban planning, and they use data, and they have staff that to carry out all of these processes. However, the most vulnerable municipalities do not, because of the tax deficit. So the paradox is that where planning is required the most, and where there is more vulnerability at the social level and risk, they are focused in those municipalities with very few resources. That is a challenge that we found, and we haven't been able to solve that. Maybe we could think about having planning institutes at the metropolitan level for each municipality to attempt to cover, to bridge these gaps. As we were saying, there is a data boom, so to speak, and which are readily available for free, as well as tools that have arisen in the last few years, for the use of satellite imaging, which is a lot easier and more cheaper to use, but it still requires a specialized staff, a programmer, or somebody that can use Python for certain programming skills, which is difficult and will cost money, because of course we cannot hire a private person, which will be far more expensive than a public groups. So it is important to see how we can attract people with those profiles so that they can use this data properly and use this incredible satellite imaging infrastructure. That is one of our biggest challenges, to use that human capacity. And regarding the income, and these areas that require higher income. And I don't know if there's going to be a leapfrogging in this subject. However, there is a conference that I attend every 2 years where where the key advances in computational urbanism is presented. This is the CUPO, computers for urban planning and management, ¿no? For one planning and management. Computers for urban planning and management. So this year, when I was there in June, UCL London, it is insane what the difference 2 years make. So there was the boom of satellite imaging, classifiers and algorithms, AI algorithm for satellite imaging. 2 years later was LMS, so ChatGPT, for example, language models. Several of the conferences that I attended were made an assessment at the academic level that what we are seeing now in planning in the last years is similar to what happened in the 80s regarding planning, when geographic information systems arrived and revolutionized everything. So that happened in the 80s, and now so we're having a new revolution. That was a very cutting edge technology then, and now 40 years later, we are having a similar breaking point where with this type of tools, there is a number of tools that are being used for urban development. So we are facing a very drastic and dramatic technological change, and of the abilities, the capabilities that we have to use these technologies. Thank you. Thank you for that, Roberto. That's very interesting because we were speaking about the complexity of urban planning because of many elements that arise in the region, such as getting all the wills together and having a process that involves everyone at every step of the way. However, maybe the technological solutions that can bridge those gaps, maybe we don't need to program in Python. It's more using GIS in the 80s, which was cryptic knowledge, and using that modeling, all the available information, as Jeff was saying. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Roberto. Now we are going to move on with the pilot study cases. We are staying to the end. We can have the Q&A, and now we're going to see this case studies with Alex Jimenez and Luis Amauris, leader of the urban planning of Puerto Plata, Dominican Republic. Please come in. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. Public officials. I'm Luis Amauris Tavares of the Puerto Plata Mayor's Office. Alongside Alex Jimenez, we will talk to you. Allow me to share my screen for a second. I'm going to talk about the integration of environmental determinations and risks in territorial planning in Puerto Plata, Dominican Republic.
Adelante, Luis, ya vemos de riesgos en la planificación territorial de Puerto Plata, República Dominicana.
So again, we have integration of the environmental determinations and risks in Puerto Plata, Dominican Republic. Puerto Plata municipality is located at the north of the Dominican Republic. It is divided in 3 parts, which are San Felipe de Puerto Plata, VLC Cariba and nine more. The main economic activities in the municipality are tourism, livestock farming, and fishing. You can see how the growth of the urban areas has been around the main roads which connect the municipalities. So we see the importance of doing proper urban planning. We have the tensions and trends of urban growth, Puerto Plata municipality. We see the consolidation of the growth of urban areas along the main roads. There are impacts on body waters and ecosystem services for the supply due to a lack of regulation on the protection areas. There is also a greater pressure on protected areas such as La Loma Isabel, which causes habitat fragmentation and general local biodiversity affectations. There is an expansion of the urban stain at the coastal edges as a consequence of the tourism sector growth. And there is a dependency of other urban areas on the services and equipment of San Felipe. We have the regulatory framework for environment and risk management. The main regulations that we have, Law 368 of 2022, which is the law on territorial organization, use of soil and human settlements. We have the criteria for territorial planning at the first level, which is environmental sustainability, biodiversity protection, hydro efficiency, risk management, and mitigation and adaptation to climate change. And the regulatory basis for the environment and risks, we have the following laws. The law of 2000 on the environment and natural resources, Law 64 2000, excuse me. Then we have Law 147 of 2002, which is the risk management policy. And now we have the determinations for urban planning. We have soil, water sources and their surrounding areas, biological diversity, coastal and marine resources, forests, mining resources, and protected areas such as non-urban areas not subject to urbanization. Risk management must orient territorial occupation with a special emphasis in vulnerable settlements. Climate change adaptation and mitigation measures must be a transversal focus in territorial planning. The principle of no environmental regression guarantees a permanence in conservation conditions. Now we have the territorial diagnosis. Here we have challenges and opportunities. So the greatest challenge we have faced is a lack of information to work at the municipality level. And we had to carry out different activities to perform particular studies in the field to collect information that was correct and accurate. Among our challenges, we have a deficit of regional and local studies on climate risks, biophysical risks, and the conservation status of natural areas. We had limited or out-of-date information to support our rigorous exercise for the classification of soil and usage of the soil. We had a low capacity of urban control to regulate conflicts such as undue use of areas of environmental importance, such as river protection areas, protected areas,
protegidas y sus franjas de
and,
amortiguamiento.
and support
Las
areas.
oportunidades que esto nos da
Among the
tenemos
opportunities that
implementar la
we found,
información
we
disponible
have
y priorizar
implementing the
información
information
primaria
available and
clave para
prioritizing
apoyar
key
la toma de
primary
decisiones,
information to support
análisis
decision
de
making.
inteligencia
We also have
artificial sobre
AI analysis on the orthomosaic,
articulación con
and we
procesos
had the
de otras
articulation
agendas
with processes
nacionales
from
y
other
locales
national and
hacia
local
la
agendas,
reacción al cambio
such as the
climático y
National
la
Plan
catástrofe.
for Climate Change Adaptation and the Multi-Purpose Cadastre.
Entonces, en el diagnóstico territorial,
So here now
se
we have
identificaron tres amenazas
the territorial
de
diagnosis.
riesgo. Se identificaron tres
So we
amenazas
identified
que
three
se deben
risk areas
priorizar
that need to
por
be
tsunami, por
prioritized by tsunami,
como lo vemos en los
as we saw, for
imágenes, y por
example, in
vientos
these
huracanados.
images,
Esto
and hurricanes. Obviously,
tiene como impacto la toma
this
de
has as an
decisiones
impact to it impact the decision making helps us to
lo que son los
recommend
parámetros
constructive
normativos de
parameters
desarrollo rural
urban development
específicos
that can be
para cada
specific
zona
for each
identificada
identified
según
zone
su nivel de
according
exposición
to its
a cada
level
una
of
de las
exposure
amenazas,
to each one of the
incentivar
threats
evaluaciones
to motivate or to
sobre otras
foster
amenazas
complementary assessments on
consideradas,
other non-considered threats. For
deslizamientos,
example,
temperaturas
mudslides,
y
stream
profundización
temperatures, and
del
deepening
nivel
at a
de
level of
exposición de
assessment
amenazas
for
priorizadas.
prioritized threats.
Proveer estrategias
Obviously, fostering strategies and mechanisms
una
that
adecuada
allow for a
prevención
proper prevention of
de
impact
impactos
or
y
consequences
consecuencias sobre la
on
población
the
ubicada en zonas
coastal
costeras.
population. Now let's talk about the territorial diagnostic
Parte ambiental,
and about the environmental assessment.
determinantes, que son
So
áreas
we will
protegidas, ecosistemas
obviously
estratégicos,
prioritize
infraestructuras
protected
costales
areas,
y
strategic
áreas
ecosystem,
productivas.
forests,
Entre las
and
áreas
productive areas.
protegidas
Within the
tenemos
protected
que
areas,
las más importantes
we
son la
have
Loma Isabel
the
de Torres
Loma
y
Isabel,
sus
which
áreas
is
de
the Isabel Mountain and its
amortiguamiento
areas of
y sus
protection,
vías panorámicas. En
and the
la
panoramic road.
cobertura boscosa,
In the forests,
perdón, en el ecosistema
sorry,
estratégico
in the strategic
se
ecosystem,
destacan las playas
we
y los
have
humedales.
obviously
En las coberturas
the
boscosas
beaches and
tenemos
mangroves.
que hay que
Obviously,
promover la
and the coastal zones,
conservación y son las que promueven las
we
actividades
have obviously all the forests that
ecológicas.
protect
Y en las
all
áreas
ecological activities,
productivas,
and in productive areas, we have
subsuelos,
from subsoil,
que no haya
and
conflictos.
so that we don't have any type of user conflict.
Entonces,
So,
tenemos reglamentar,
we
usos
need to
productivos
regulate
y usos
productive
preventivos
areas
en áreas de
and
protección para
obviously
conflictos
areas for protected use
socioambientales,
for
condicionar
environmental
el
use
desarrollo
to
urbano
condition
con baja
obviously
pendiente,
urban development
alta capacidad de drenaje,
with high
baja
capacity of
capacidad
drainage
agroagrícola,
and low
consolidar la
agricultural
pública principal
capacity,
del municipio a
obviously to
partir de
consolidate the
reconocer
main ecological
el
structure
valor
of the municipality
ecológico
from
de los
acknowledging the ecological
ecosistemas
value of biotic and anti and abiotic elements
garantizar
to
el
harmonize
emplazamiento de proyectos productivos
the
mediante la reglamentación del uso del
creation of
suelo.
productive projects through the regulation of
Este
use
esquema
or
que
soil
podemos
use.
ver aquí
The
abajo,
schematics that we see down here, and as
todo
you can
lo
see,
que se
everything
tuvo
that has
que tomar en
to
cuenta para el
take
diagnóstico ambiental
everything that we
en
had
la
to take into
matriz
account
de
for
suelo y el aire del
environmental
agua.
prognosis.
Hemos
For example, we have a soil matrix,
transformado
air matrix,
esos
and then
cuatro
water matrix.
determinantes
This is for the
naturales
transformed
que acabamos
environment.
de mencionar
Now, let's talk
anteriormente.
about nature, protected areas, the
A
strategic
continuación,
ecosystems. We
seguimos
just
con Alex
mentioned
Jiménez
those.
y su
Up next, we
presentación.
have Alex Jimenez and his presentation. Alex, take it away.
Bueno, voy a ser muy breve. Consultor.
So I'm part of the consulting team that is supporting this land use plan of the municipality of Puerto Plata. So as urban plan development, Luis, this municipality has a territory that's quite
Tres municipios, sus centros urbanos principales, los
with
cuales es San Felipe
three maintenance San Fe
de dicho,
and
unidad de
the
urbano
other mountains as well. But obviously, let's remember that we have three zones. As you've seen, we've been working with an essential premise, which is the formulation of this land use plan from the understanding of the climate risk management and from also from ethics to do with environmental determining factors. But if you want, I can share with you in a second quite quickly. Can you see my screen? Can you see my screen?
Luis, ¿está bien si tú la mantienes?
Yeah.
No había que cambiar. Creo que ahí ya la están viendo mi pantalla.
So I think you can see my screen right now. Yes, Alex, we can see it. All right. So quite quickly, from this analysis we've done, obviously, main factors, obviously, we did a really broad multi-dimensional analysis, including economic, social, demographic variables. However, we want to show the exercise that we are creating and that allows us to make proper decisions. And obviously, this has to do with what the law determines from the land use bill or project or law in the Dominican Republic, and it's obviously in its rating. So here we have been working determining what types of soil or have the capacity of being urban and urbanizable, and what soil should be rural or just determined as places of impossible construction from two criteria. Yeah, risks to climate change and natural disasters, and the second one that has to do with environment and natural resources. Other types of criteria that we have here that lead us to this first categorization. Afterwards, the process and the law determines that we need to categorize the soil. So from an analysis that's called use feasibility analysis, obviously we mix our main criteria, for example, natural threats, natural disaster threat, and climate change, and other complementary risks that with our geospatial analysis, as Roberto and Jeff have been mentioning, our analysis that thanks to digital tools so that we can develop. And the idea is precisely to be able to define what those of land use that can be proper, that can be more ideal to support these urban activities and rural activities as well. As we've seen, for example, coastal, marine soil, obviously something that has to do with agricultural practices for productive order, forests, and to determine the productive areas, and also areas of mining exploitation. So, as we mentioned before, something that we've done in a more participative way, we have identified that both in the practice and in the literature, there's an absence of local entities and what multiple stakeholders can participate of these processes of prioritization that are fundamental at the time of applying these multi-criteria analysis technologies for the creation of these land use plans. So here we're just showing you some analysis that we've done with the participation of the urban planning unit, but we've also done that with our own specialists. And this allowed us to identify that these two criteria of threats areas for climate change and environmental protection areas, and also for the definition of urban soil and rural soil are quite determinant and important. So I would just like to highlight that all this process of planning and formulation of this planning for the Puerto Plata municipality has been involving many stakeholders. We've had kids, teenagers, we've had, for example, trading associations with the private sector as well, and with other authorities as well. So everything that has to do with this information analysis has allowed us to start, prioritize, and define four key issues that have to do with the renaturalization of high-risk rivers margins due to floods, restoration of mangroves with the reduction of risk with the increase of sea levels in coastal zones, strengthening of cultural landscapes associated to agroforestry and crops, coffee crops and cocoa and chocolate crops or cocoa crops that foster the protection and the preservation of these local economies, and also sustainable agriculture practices, and obviously land acquisition as well for the protection of water productive zones. Obviously, this means social and human development of these people. Fourth project that has to do with some, once again, with sustainable agricultural practices and also regulation of land acquisition for the protection of water sources. Basically, what we're expecting from this definition of planning or planification instrument from risk management and from environmental determining factors, precisely for us to be able to regulate in a determining way those strategic environmental zones, and obviously some zones that have high threat levels, especially to avoid informal settlements or settlements that are not appropriate for this type of soil. Finally, it's really important to strengthen local capabilities or capacities to strengthen those risk analysis, and obviously for these processes to support the regulation and the definition codes for high risk zones so that we can have standards and codes for construction. And obviously it's key to have some technical and regulatory basis for the development of these plans for the settlements in populations that live in these zones of high risk. So we'll stop there. Thank you. Luis, go ahead. And in this case, since we don't have the strength or environmental strength, and starting using this instrument, maybe we will have some guidelines that regulate the use and to protect the areas. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Alex y Luis, por
Thank you, Alex,
de San Felipe de
for
Puerto
sharing this
Plata,
experience of San
República
Felipe
Dominicana.
in Puerto Plata in the Dominican Republic. We have really important
información
aspects
de
in how
diferentes fuentes como
we
recursos
combine this
participativos,
information from different
tomando
sources
muy en
with the
cuenta
participative
son las
processes
regulaciones y la
and taking into
normativa
account the necessary with
nacional.
regulations
Así que muchas gracias
and
por
with
esta
national
experiencia tan
regulations.
relevante.
So thank you
Vamos
for
a
this
pasar al
revealing
caso
experience.
piloto
Now moving on
de
to the
San
next pilot case
Felipe,
with
directora de
Francisca
Espacio
Celis
Público y Asesora
Contardo,
Urbanista de la
Public
Municipalidad
Space Director for
de
the
La
municipality
Barnechea.
of La
Bienvenida,
Barnechea in Chile. Francisca, the floor is all yours. Hello, good morning to you all. I'm going to share my presentation with you right now.
¿La ven ahí?
Can you see it? Can you see my presentation? Yes, we can see it.
Bueno,
Go ahead, Francisca. But the case that we are going to show you today is the regulating community plan or La Barnechea. And just to start, let's talk about La Barnechea. La Barnechea is one of the 52 communities that we have in the metropolitan area of Santiago de Chile, and it's at the western edge of the region. Is characterized by its mixture, socioeconomic mixture, and by being a community with foothills and a mountain ridge, and obviously we have a high natural value. This township, in this sense, it has a really important landscape value, and also it has direct access to the Andes mountain range and to all ski resorts. So we have a 95.5 of its territory as an ecological preservation area. It's an area that's completely rural. Only 4.5 is allocated to urban development. So to this end, the La Barnechea township has two urban areas. One is called the main urban area, called it the Valle sector, or the flat sector, that has around 49 square kilometers, and is located at the foothill. It's a topography, like I said, it's a foothill, and now we have the mountain range center that is located 35 kilometers east of this valley sector, is in the Andes mountain range with the surface of 7.56 square kilometers. So within this urban planning, we have our, obviously we need to address these two. We have two areas that's part of this community centers, and obviously that's being called an ecological preservation area because of its natural character and its natural protection policies. So this township, as I mentioned before, is within the mountain range, surrounded by a lot of fountains, a lot of waterfalls, sorry. And obviously we have 131 glaciers. And these gorges as well. We have four main sources of water, which is the Mapocho River, the San Francisco River, the Estero, Yerba Loca, and Molina. On top of that, in accordance to the census that was carried out in 2024, La Barnechea has a population of 112,620 inhabitants. So this is just of an introduction so that we can delve in everything that has to do with risk management and environmental management. So as an introduction, in the La Barnechea Township, starting in the year 2002, it has a regulating plan for the township. And obviously the challenge that started with this municipality in La Barnechea, starting in the year 2019, was the update of this community regulating plan to bring all the criteria that had to do with environmental protection and risk management. So to this end, this regulating plan was started in the year 2019, and I would like to let you know that right now we are at the final approval stage. So in the upcoming months, we will be able to post our new township regulation booklet that aims to achieve the following goals: to protect all environmental areas, to foster the creation of green infrastructure, and obviously a balanced distribution of the identification and occupation of the land, to improve urban mobility conditions, and to foster a diversified population in context that will foster social cohesion. As we mentioned before, the La Barnechea Township, even though there's a lot of rich people there, there's also some poor population. So it's important everything that has to do with integration purpose, social integration purposes, social, spatial, and socioeconomic. So the challenges of this plan that have to do with environmental development assessment, that share the development of all this plan in terms of compliance of these environmental goals were based in 6 critical decision-making factors. One was to create places with identity and life quality. 2, obviously, landscape and environmental reservations. 3rd, risk management and vulnerability reduction. 4th, the social, spatial, socioeconomic integration. 5, sustainable urban mobility. And 6th, regeneration, urban regeneration. Now, let's move on to risk management and how this is part of this urban planning. So we, as a township, we are susceptible to different types of risks that condition the planning, and they're given because of a geographical and geological situation. So this and for the development of this update of this regulating plan in the township, we developed a risk study that's quite complete, wholesome, that in methodological terms covered the collection and review of a lot of background: regulatory studies, topographic studies, cartology studies, hydrologic studies, historic information, and everything that has to do with satellite imagery. So with that, we were able to adapt these phases, and obviously besides having our cadastre of all the dangers and hazards that we had recorded in our scope. At the end, this led us to have diagnosis of all the dangers and threats in the territory to be able to create the modeling of this and to establish a map of risks and threats, and finally to establish the risk areas that are defined by these constructions and that current Chilean regulations that in this sense will be good to let you know what is the definition that we have for this legislation in Chile for risk protected areas. So risk protected areas will be understood as those territories which will issue determined type of risks for natural disasters or others that will need for its urbanization, the incorporation of a re-engineering of all practice to heal or to protect people from those hazards. So in accordance to that article and what we're seeing here, so to establish the different risk tags that are present in the territory. So to this end, these risk areas that are present in the Lo Barnechea township in the urban area, because the regulating plan of the community, everything has to do with the 4.5% of the territory, which is the community area, which would be obviously the floodable zones or potentially floodable, because everything has to do, I don't know, with tsunami or proximity of water in the coast, gorges, and non-channel water. And obviously, in this case, in the Lo Barnechea township, here we highlight lands, because obviously any type of natural disasters, rivers, and a lot of gorges, and everything that has to do with nesting, because it happens with other type of mini gorges. So on top of that, we have the second typology, which are the zones that will maybe suffer any type of landslide or other disasters that in this case, in particular in Lo Barnechea, are the events that happen the most. For example, everything that has to do with landslides and obviously all other processes. So finally, we have a third typology, which are the zones with hazard being affected by volcanic activity. And obviously everything has to do with volcanoes that are not addressed by the plan. We are a population that we are totally vulnerable to earthquakes. As you know, Chile is a country that suffers a lot of earthquakes, but definitely we have a regulation that establishes conditions for the structuring and constructions. So in that sense, we have a Chilean regulation that rules on this matrix. So regarding what I mentioned before, we have the signal study and how we can obviously the mud flows in the different districts. This is the mud in yellow. The scale of 1 to 40,000. The following mud, you can read the susceptibility this process. At scale, what is represented in color yellow for everything that has to do with slopes or hillsides. Moderate susceptibility to high susceptibility in the red. Susceptibility to flood, because maybe there's a gorge that will overflow. This is at a scale of 1 to 40,000. Where we see where all the water channels, basically what it's channeling to, its flows and its levels of risk. Everything that we mentioned in accordance to the value of intensity that the color blue. So finally, with all these typologies of risk, there's an integrated matrix that you can see here, and taking a look at the vulnerability that we have and the susceptibility, the high, very high or moderate susceptibility. We create a map where we represent all the different types of risks and everything that has to do everything has to do with the planning decisions. These risk areas live high and very high risks, and that you can see in this map. Here we see a representation of everything that we have here. She's having a lot of connection problems for our audience in English, determined in resources that will be for floodable areas, for example, that we have in the color blue. Also, we have the AR2V, which are the reduction in mass risk areas because of hillsides or any type of landslides, which are in color red. And finally, we have AR3B, which is risk area for erosion in mass because of mud flows and everything that happens with these floods that is completely associated to the color blue, which is a different shade of blue, but it's always allocated to everything that has to do with the river flows and that are met in this representation here.
Para hacer y cómo llevar esto a la planificación urbana ya
How to take this to urban planning?
decisiones de
Well,
planificación y
and
zonificación
to zoning,
ya y establecer
we
los
need to
distintos usos de suelo y las
establish the different use of
intensidades del uso,
soils and
como la
densities,
densidad,
such as
alturas,
density,
etcétera, y toda
height,
la
and so
urbanística
on, and
asociada,
all the
se
associated
definieron dos
regulation.
criterios.
We defined two
Un criterio era
principles,
para
the
las áreas
criteria.
consolidadas,
One was for
ya
consolidated areas,
anteriormente,
as I
es un
mentioned
plan regular
previously.
comunal que existe desde el
This is
año
a,
2002.
this is a
Y
plan
ahora
that
tenemos
exists
además,
since
anterior a eso, ya con
2002.
el plan regulador metropolitano de
We also
Santiago,
have the
muchos
regulated
proyectos y
Santiago plan
construcciones aprobadas.
and many
Por lo
other
tanto, tenemos en
approved
la
projects and
comuna una
construction.
situación
So in the
concreta de áreas
community, we have a very
consolidadas del territorio
concrete,
y además,
consolidated
por ser una
territorial
comuna
areas.
bastante nueva,
And we have
también tenemos áreas no consolidadas todavía y
non-consolidated
que están
areas,
en el fondo todavía hay que
which are
urbanizar. Por lo tanto, se
still
adoptaron
pending for
criterios
urbanization. So
distintos
we took
para
a
estos dos
different
conceptos,
criteria for the
¿ya?
two
Y
areas.
esto referido al riesgo más importante que
And
en
this
el
refers
fondo
to the
nosotros
main risk
es más difícil de mitigar.
that is
Porque,
the
para
hardest to
efectos de
mitigate
lo
for
que
us because
los riesgos de inundación, ya
for what
existen
regards flood
posibilidades
risk,
de hacer
there
generar
is a
proyectos que puedan
possibility of
mitigar ese riesgo
creating
para que
projects
puedan
to
coexistir
mitigate
las
this
edificaciones.
risk
Pero para el
for
caso de lo que
buildings
tiene que
to
ver con los
coexist.
procesos de
But
ladera
regarding
con muy altas
with
pendientes,
very high
es más
slopes,
complejo poder
that is, it
generar
becomes a lot
proyectos que
more complex to
mitiguen
create
el impacto
mitigation
y
projects for
esa
the
vulnerabilidad que
impact
existe
and
al
vulnerability
riesgo.
that
Por
exists,
lo tanto, para las áreas
vulnerability to risks
consolidadas,
that exists.
efectivamente que ya hay
So for
construcciones
consolidated
existentes,
areas where
se
we have
determinó ya que
existing
para
construction,
las terrenos
we
con pendientes
said that
inferiores al
slope with
26,7%, obviamente hay
terrain
un
with
riesgo
less than a
moderado y por lo tanto hay
26.7
una
slope, there is
certificación
a
que se
moderate
puede
risk.
dar de
So
forma
there is a
tranquila
certification that we
ya
can
de
provide
manera
without issue
bajo los conceptos de otros
under the
criterios
concept
que
of other
tengan que ver
criteria
con
that relate
densificar, generar en el fondo mayores alturas y
to generate
densidades
higher
en
densities and
sectores comunales
heights
de la comuna que están
in
asociados a
structural
corredores
commune
viales,
areas
etc.
associated with
Después,
roads and so on.
desde las pendientes del
Then from
26,7% al
those
36,4%, que es
slopes
un
from
riesgo alto, ya
26.7 to
se ha propuesto lo que es
34.4%
una
is a high risk.
habilitación condicionada,
We
ya,
propose a
y
condition
finalmente
habilitation,
para
and then
las áreas de muy alto
for
riesgo
areas of
ya hay
very
un
high
desarrollo
risk,
controlado, con
we have a
densidades muy bajas, ya
uh,
para poder
control risk with
disminuir
very
lo
low
que
densities
sería
so as to diminish
esta amenaza de
this
riesgo.
threat of
Para los
or
sectores o las
risk.
áreas no consolidadas
For the
hay un
non-consolidated
criterio
areas,
distinto.
there is a different
Efectivamente, se repite que
criteria.
para las pendientes
So of
moderadas,
course we moderate
efectivamente,
slope to
se está
26.7%.
planteado como un área
It's still
urbanizable.
set as
Para
an area
los pendientes
that can
entre
be urbanized. For slopes
26,7% y
between
el
26.7 and
36,4%, hay una habilitación
36.4%,
condicionada, ya con
there is a
un
conditioned
desarrollo
habilitation
también
as
controlado,
with
donde la
control
idea es
development,
no
where
permitir
the
equipamiento que
idea
sea
is to
sensible,
have
¿ya?
feasible
Y finalmente,
equipment,
para el riesgo
and
muy
then
alto,
for
que
very
son
high risk of over
46,6%, se plantea
46.6%,
en el fondo una restricción al
we
desarrollo.
have a restriction to
En ese
development.
sentido, ¿cuál es el
In that
planteamiento para
sense,
esas áreas que
what,
efectivamente tienen
what are we
muy
saying? Those
pendiente
areas with a
y
very
son
high,
áreas
very
no
high
consolidadas,
slopes
se
that are
plantean unas áreas
non-consolidated?
verdes nuevas, ¿ya?
We
Que corresponden
propose
a estos
new
sectores de
green
muy alto
areas, which
riesgo
are
de procesos
areas
de
with
ladera,
very
en el
high
fondo
risk
para no
due to
propiciar
slopes, in
la
order to
construcción y en los asentamientos
avoid
humanos, ¿ya?
human settlement and construction
Y
in these
así
areas.
hacer una gestión del riesgo adecuada
This to
respecto de la
properly
planificación
manage
urbana.
risk regarding urban planning.
Aquí ustedes pueden ver en el plano
Here in the plan,
grafican las áreas verdes,
you see the green
donde
areas,
efectivamente
the
está
AVN1,
restringido el
where
desarrollo urbano, y los
urban
colores más
development
marrón
is
o café, podemos
prohibited.
visualizar lo que
And
son las
in
áreas de
brown,
desarrollo
you can
controlado,
see areas for
que
control
también
urban
coinciden mucho
development
con
and
lo que es el
planning, which
límite
also
urbano
match with
de
the urban limits
del área urbana de la comuna de Lobarnechea hacia lo que sería el área
of the
rural, lo que
Lobarnechea
sería
city
el
area.
área de preservación ecológica. Y
When,
la
and you see
idea
that
es
they
que
are
todas
very
las
close to these
densidades vayan disminuyendo
ecological
hacia
preservation
el
areas.
contacto con el límite urbano, efectivamente porque ahí
So
las
the idea
pendientes
is
y
to
los
diminish
cerros
contact with the
son mucho
metropolitan
más
area because
pronunciados
the
y ahí
slopes and
hay
mountains are a lot
resguardo
more
desde el
pronounced,
punto de
and so
vista
there is
de
a
la protección
safekeeping
ambiental y
for,
el valor
from a
paisajístico y
standpoint of
también por la
landscaping and
sostenibilidad y la
environmental
vulnerabilidad
protection,
que hay a
and
sus
as
territorios
well as the
frente a los
protection
riesgos de sucesión de ladera.
of these areas against
Finalmente,
the
les queríamos
potential risks due
mostrar
to slopes.
acá
Lastly, we
algunos
wanted to
casos que
show
hemos
you
tenido de
some
ejemplo
cases that we
y que
saw,
en el fondo
some
nos llaman
examples
a hacernos responsables de la gestión del
that call
riesgo,
upon us
sobre
to
todo en
take
los
charge of
procesos de ladera
risk
con muy
management
altas pendientes en los cerros,
due to
en
these
en
slopes in the
particular de
mountains, as I
Loarnechea,
mentioned,
con
in
respecto a,
Barnechea
por ejemplo,
specifically.
un sector que se llama Punta de Águila,
We would have
ya
Punta del
en,
sector that we
en
can see
Las
in verse
Primeras
few
tenemos
images
el
in
2012,
2012.
ya
So
este
the
proyecto se
project was
construyó,
already
un
carried out. It
proyecto
was a
residencial
residential
de
living
vivienda, ya que
housing
efectivamente hizo sus
project
mitigaciones, construyó sus muros de contención.
it made some walls, it
Ya
the
vemos que del
but
terreno y
by
del cerro,
2013
ya que generalmente
there
en
was
el
a slight
2014
slide of the
genera
terrain
ya
and the mountain,
que
and
se
by
destruye
2014 we saw
efectivamente
destruction
dos
of
viviendas
housing
y la tercera
units,
quedó
and a
totalmente
third was
afectada por esta
absolutely
situación.
damaged by
Por
this.
eso la importancia de informar
This
dentro de
is
los planes
why it is
reguladores
so
y generar
important
las
to
áreas de riesgo para que
inform within the
efectivamente
regulation plans and
controlar el desarrollo urbano en un
control
sector
urban
que
planning in
efectivamente
these
de haber sido un
areas,
área no consolidada
which
hoy,
if there were
no
a
estaríamos
non-consolidated area
frente a esta
today,
situación,
this is
ya porque
the
efectivamente
situation
se
would be
habrían
completely different
tomado criterios ya
because
proteger ya y
we would have decided
zonificar
to
con algo
protect
que
and
no
properly
permitiera los llamados
zone
asentamientos ya
in an
residenciales.
area that
Ahora,
wouldn't
el
allow
2024
residential
podemos ver una nueva
construction. In
fotografía de esa línea,
2024, that the last
se
picture to the top right,
visualizan los muros
we
de
see the
contención
contention
y las
walls
obras
and the
de
defense
defensa que se
works
tuvieron
that
que
needed to be
reestructurar y
restructured
volver a construir
and
ya para poder
rebuilt
mitigar este riesgo
so as to
latente, ya
mitigate this latent
para
risk,
asegurar la estabilidad estructural de esas
so
viviendas.
as to ensure the housing
En la
unit
segunda línea de
stability.
fotografías
In
podemos
the
ver que
second line
en
of
el año
pictures, we see in
este es el caso de
2022,
Camino
this
Gran
is Camino
Vista,
Gran
también en un
Vista,
sector
a
alto de la
very high
comunidad con grandes pendientes,
sector
sufrimos el
of the commune.
deslizamiento de las obras
We
de
saw the
defensa y
slide
protección del
of the
terreno
defense
que
and
se habían ejecutado
protection
durante la
of
urbanización de ese proyecto. Ya vemos que el
the works
2024
of the area, and then we
el
see that
terreno
by
se dio
2024,
completamente,
the
ya
terrain totally gave
ahí
out,
vemos también cómo ha sido el
and we
proceso
see the process
del desarrollo
of the development
de los daños que
of
se
damages
causaron
that
a
were
raíz del
caused
deslizamiento
due
del
to
terreno
the
y que hasta el día de
slides,
hoy
and that
todavía
to
no
date
se resuelven
has not been
los
resolved
proyectos adecuados para
because the
mitigar ese
adequate
riesgo,
projects
considerando
haven't
ya
really
que
been
la
carried out,
urbanización está
taking into
construida y las viviendas
consideration that
ya existen
the
en el
urbanization
territorio.
already
Y
exists, as
además
well as
el
the
problema ya se
housing
ha
units,
traspasado a un
and
tercero, que ya es
the
el
problem has
propietario de
already
su
been
yajara,
migrated to a
ya,
third
y
party who owns
efectivamente
their
las
house,
obligaciones
and
civiles
in
que
effect,
existen
the civil
respecto de los
obligations that
proyectistas o
arise
los
from
desarrolladores
the
que ejecutaron
developers
este loteo,
who
ya
made
prescribieron, por
this
lo
plan.
tanto, en el fondo ya van a
All of
ser
that has already
problemas
expired,
del
so
propio
this now
habitante. En
becomes
ese sentido, y
an issue of
como
the
para rematar la
citizen
presentación,
that lives
Lo
here.
Barnechea
And
es una de las comunas,
now
incluso de
to
Chile,
end, the Barnechea is one of
pioneras
the
en
communes in Chile
incorporar
that is a
dentro de su
pioneer in
planificación
incorporating
urbana
within its
todo lo que
urban
tiene que ver con la
planning
protección ambiental
everything
y la
regarding
gestión del riesgo.
environmental planning and
Situación
risk
que
management,
en zonas urbanas que ya efectivamente ya
which is a
tenían un
situation
plan
in
regulador
urban areas
anterior
that
con una
already had
normativa
a
mucho más
previous
laxa al respecto, se hace mucho
urban
más
planning management that was
complejo intervenir los
a lot less
territorios porque
strict, and it
efectivamente
makes it more difficult to
los
intervene in the
residentes
territories
y los
because
dueños de
then
sus
the
viviendas
residents
efectivamente
and
se
the
sienten
owners
como que
of
hay
the housing
un
units
daño a su
feel
patrimonio al
that there is
incorporar
a
estas áreas de
damage
riesgo.
to
Pero por
their
otro lado, la
equity
transparencia y el mercado del suelo
by
nos
including this.
obliga ya
However,
a que todos los
the nature of the
propietarios
soil itself
de la comuna
forces
y los
all of
vecinos
us,
conozcan
owners of the commune
siempre,
and neighbors,
independiente que el riesgo riesgo haya
we
sido
need to know that
mitigado, están en un área de riesgo.
know that
Estas
despite
cosas
the fact
pueden
that
suceder en el
the risk was
territorio.
mitigated,
Y lo
the
que
risk
busca
persists, and these
este plan
things can
regulador
happen.
comunal con
And
toda
so
esta
what this community
actualización
regulation
respecto a la gestión
plan
del
and
riesgo
its
ya
update
es poder
looks for
mitigar y
or
disminuir
aims is
la
to
exposición
mitigate
al
or
riesgo del
diminish the
territorio que todavía no ha
exposure
sido
to risk of the
urbanizado
area
y
that hasn't
generar
been
conciencia en los sectores
urbanized
ya
yet,
consolidados
and to
respecto de
create
que
raise awareness
el
about
riesgo
in
se
the areas
mitiga,
that has
pero no se elimina. Y
where
finalmente,
the risk
las obras de
has been
defensa
mitigated,
y
but
todos
that
los
the risk is
proyectos
not
que
eliminated.
se realicen
And
o se
so
ejecutan
all the
para mitigar
projects that
ese
are
riesgo
executed to
deben
mitigate
ser
this risk
mantenidos
must
en el
be
tiempo
maintained through time,
bajo conservación, porque efectivamente todo material
as
tiene
already
fatiga, los terrenos
all
van
materials
cambiando,
give out
cada
in
proyecto
time, and
modifica el
the
territorio
terrain
y
pushes
la calidad
against
del
the
suelo, y
contention, and the
efectivamente eso
resources
puede
and the
generar
soil quality
siempre nuevas
always generate
alertas ya
new
para
alerts
nuevos desastres o
for
algún
new
tipo de
disasters
daño a
or
las
new
construcciones.
types of construction
Así que bueno,
damages.
esa ha sido un poco la presentación y
This is a bit of my
resumen
my
de lo que
presentation
ha
and
sido
a
nuestro
summary
trabajo del
of
Plan Regulador
our
Comunal de
work
lo
of the
Barnechea,
regulator
que
of
esperamos
the
dentro
Barnechea
de este
Regulation
año
Plan. I
2025
hope
poder
that
promulgar.
within this 2025 we can continue to promulgate the plan.
No, muchas gracias, Francisca. Muy interesante, muy clara cómo se
Thank
fueron
you for
sumando los diferentes elementos, desde los
explanation,
mapas, la
Francisca.
regulación,
We saw how
algunos
the
ejemplos
regulation
creo que
and the
son
maps and all the
todo súper
examples came
ilustrativos, ¿no?
together
De
very nicely. It was
la
very
complejidad que
very
tiene a
clearly
veces
illustrative,
gestionar el
and
riesgo,
it
¿no? Puede haber
shows
obras
the
geniales, pero
complexity of the risk.
cualquier obra puede estar susceptible a
We
fallar.
see
O
that
sea que no hay
any works
obra perfecta, ¿no?
is
Y no tenemos
susceptible of failing.
Muchas gracias por esta
So
experiencia
thank
de
you
Lo Barnechea,
for
súper
sharing the
interesante
Lobarnechea experience with
y
us
la presentación
and for your
súper
presentation
estructurada.
because it was very well
Te agradecemos
structured.
mucho. Bueno, ahora tenemos
Thank you
algunas
very much.
preguntas
Now
de la
we have
audiencia.
a few
Ya
questions from
para
the audience
terminar,
to wrap
en
up.
particular tenemos una para Roberto que nos preguntaba un
Now we
poco
have one for
cuando hablabas del
Roberto.
modelo de planificación,
So when you
si era
spoke
un
about
modelo
a
más
planning
técnico, un modelo más,
model, did you
digamos,
make a more technical
reglamentario,
model
normativo, ¿no? O quizá cómo
or
se
a more
organizan estos
regulatory
proyectos cuando tú hablas
process?
de
How do you
modelo de
integrate these
planificación? Si nos pudieras
models
ilustrar un
in
poco en ese sentido.
planning, if you can
Sí, claro,
maybe
con gusto.
a little more?
Creo
Yes,
que es
of
relacionado
course.
cuando nos referimos a
I think you mean when I
conducción por
was talking
escenarios como
about
una
a
nueva
scenario
forma
planning
de
as a
planeación
new
que no
way
es
of
diferente a lo que
planning, which is
nosotros
different
típicamente hacemos.
to the plans we
Sí,
usually make.
termina con un documento que
It
es
does
un plan,
end
en el
with
sentido
a
que hay realmente
document that is
una
a
visión hacia el
plan
futuro y se definen una serie de estrategias e
with a
instrumentos.
now look for the
Pero
future
sí
and a
es un proceso
series
también
of
más largo
strategies
que
and
se hace
instruments.
normalmente,
But it
porque
is
paralelamente llevas
a
una
longer process
parte
than usual
de
because
participación, mesas,
for us, of
diálogos y
course,
por otro lado otra parte
it
técnica.
is about
Entonces,
participation and
estos
work
ejercicios
tables.
en otros
And
países
so
normalmente
these
llevan
exercises in other countries
lo común.
take 2
El
to
ejemplo
3
así como
years.
más famoso ahora que todo el mundo
The
pone
clearest, most famous example
es
that
el área de la
everybody
bahía en San
provides
Francisco, que pues sí fue
is
un
the Bay
ejercicio
Area
de
in San
millones de
Francisco.
dólares,
It was a
equipo
millions of
grande
dollars
y una
project
inversión de
and
3
very
años.
large
El
equipment and
caso que nosotros estamos
3
haciendo en
years of work.
Monterrey es
So what we're doing in
un año
Monterrey
y estamos
is a
buscando
case
una extensión a un segundo
of
año.
1 year,
En este
and
primer
we are
año
looking
lo
to
que da
extend it
tiempo
for
en
2
12
years.
meses es
What we can do
terminar
in
con un
12
documento
months is to
estratégico,
wrap
una
up
serie de
and
escenarios
create a
evaluados,
strategic
así con una definición
document
de
of
futuro. No es
analyze
normativo, porque lo
scenarios.
que se usan son
It's not
estas herramientas
regulatory
para tratar de definir,
because we're just using these
explorar una
tools
serie de
to
futuros
try and explore a
que podría
series
pasar.
of
Un beneficio de usar
potential futures.
esta
A benefit
presentación por
of
escenarios es que
using
hay una incorporación de
this
incertidumbre. Los planes que
approximation
hacemos
is
tradicionalmente,
uncertainty.
si
The
cambian,
plans that
cambian,
we
si siguen
carry out
radicalmente, ya traes la
traditionally
noción.
radically
Aquí lo que haces es
change.
explorar, saber qué
So
pasa
you
si
can
A, qué pasa
explore
si B, qué
what
pasa si
happens
C.
if when
Se
C
llaman
happens. And so we
resilientes.
see
Esto es, si
resilient
pasa
instrument
A, tienes que
strategies.
hacer
So
esto.
if
Si
A
pasa B,
happens,
tienes que
if
hacer
B
esto. Y si
happens, you
pasa
do
C, tienes
this.
que hacer
And
esto.
if
Pero
C
si hay una
happens, you do
estrategia que está
this.
presente en
So
todos
we
estos
have
escenarios
a
posibles,
strategy
entonces
to
quiere decir que es
respond
algo
to
que
each scenario.
definitivamente tienes que invertir,
And that is something that, of
reditúa.
course, requires
Entonces, eso
investment.
es lo que buscamos el siguiente año, otros
What
12
we
meses,
aim for in the next 12
continuar con una
months
labor ya
is to
enfocada en
continue
cuáles son los
with a
instrumentos y
work
estrategias
focused
para
on
construir esta
instruments
visión
and
que definimos
strategies
el
to
primer
build
año,
this
¿no?
vision that we defined
Y si
in
se
the
hicieron otros
sector.
12 meses, bueno, ya ahora sí llegará un plan, ¿no? Entonces,
And
es un
if
esfuerzo más largo,
we
pero
can
creemos
plan to
que
another 12, well,
por la
then
calidad del
we
producto
to a
final
plan.
es algo que vale la pena.
And so this is the entire point is to have
Muchas
a
gracias,
final product that is worthwhile. Now we have two questions, more general questions. One is whether you can share the regulations, because the audience wants to know more. If you have more documents that you can share, the methodological or regulatory aspects. And we can discuss maybe because the audience is interested in how to integrate the environmental aspects. So now we invite you on a nature-based solution seminar, which will be on September 10th, where we will delve a lot deeper in integrating environmental aspects. So I think in every single presentation here, we managed to see the environmental aspects that can be included each dimension. I just want to thank all the panelists for sharing all their experiences and knowledge with representatives from the region. So let me tell you that we have almost 300 participants today, and I want to thank you all for joining us. We leave you this QR code that you can see here on screen, so you can scan it and assess the activity, rate the activity, because it will help us participate in the next activities of the bank. Thank you all. And I wish you a great rest of the day. Have a nice day. Thank you.